Well, hello there. I found another fantasy trope article. This one is called The Very Best Fantasy Tropes to Include in Your Writing. So these are the very best. That is an expectation. So this is from the website Jericho Writers. I'd never seen this one before, but when I looked up fantasy tropes just for the fun of it through an incognito, this one came up quite close to the top. It was on the first page, so and I hadn't seen it before, which is interesting. Anyway, this is by N.J. Simmonds. So Simmonds wrote this article on Jericho Writers. The very best fantasy tropes to include in your writing. So I don't know when this was written. It probably says on the bottom of the article. Sometimes they put it there. So we're going to see what are the very best fantasy tropes. That did a weird... That gets dark, doesn't it? It's weird. Darkness, 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 light. Darkness, 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 light. Okay, so the very best fantasy tropes. So, big expectations. Great expectations, maybe. It's great expectations. Let's read now. Fantasy tropes are some of the best literary tropes out there, except perhaps for romance. Okay, so now we already know now Simmonds likes fantasy tropes, not romance. Okay, so we've established that. Whether you're writing a fantasy novel or screenplay, you may be tempted to include fantasy tropes in your work. But likewise, you may also be nervous about using a plot device that's been used so many times it's no longer original. So how can you include fantasy tropes in your story without boring your readers? In this article, I'm going to be talking about what a fantasy trope is, listing some of the best loved common tropes along with examples. Well, that's good. We're getting some examples. And discussing the best way to incorporate fantasy tropes in your story. This sounds promising. Sort of. Okay, because sometimes articles, they make a big promise in the beginning and then they don't follow through at all. But we'll see. Hold on a moment. I need to turn off my air conditioner because it's actually kind of cold in here. I need to go get my remote control, which is by my bed, which is far from where I'm sitting right now. And I am back. I am back. I'm a sheep. We are turning that off. It is like a fridge. Okay, it's not as cold as a fridge, but it was getting a little bit cold. Okay, so what is a trope? A trope is a scenario in any story, be it a book, movie, or play, where characters react or interact in a way that is expected. Some may even go so far as to say that a genre book isn't a genre book without at least one or two well-loved tropes, at least. Interesting. Genre plays a big part in which tropes are used. Genre plays a big part in which tropes are used in which stories. You can always mix up tropes. No one is stopping a rom-com writer from sending one character off on a quest and making another a fallen hero. But when it comes to expectations, certain genres have certain tropes. I think that is true. Because, yeah, like she said, no one is stopping a rom-com writer from sending one character off a quest. That is true. No one is stopping them. I mean, but I think that would turn into a romantasy novel. Romantasy is a big term these days. Characters, a trope is a scenario where characters react or interact in a way that is expected. That is the best definition I've seen so far of a trope. So far, people have been confusing trope and cliche, and I got a comment on one of my videos that said trope and cliche have been, even though they don't essentially mean the same thing, like the original definition isn't the same, they've been made into synonyms and people use them interchangeably, even though that is confusing and a little bit wrong. People are using trope and cliche interchangeably, which is a problem. But anyway, so for instance, in horror, you may get an innocent person or object, child, doll, pet, that becomes possessed. And in romance, readers expect to see characters go from being enemies to lovers or to have a happy ending. I don't know if they expect them to be enemies to lovers, but anyway. And in fantasy, which we'll be focusing on in this article, readers expect to see characters go on a quest, discover they are the chosen one, or become the hero who uses a magic sword to fight a dark lord. Well, these are some of the tropes that they're listing. She's not going to go into all of the tropes in the beginning, okay? So let's take a look at some of the most common tropes found in fantasy stories listed in relation to popular categories found within the fantasy genre. Okay, so this list is not a random list. It's in relation, let me see. It's in relation to popular categories found within the fantasy genre. So like if you get a list of what fantasy tropes, like the top fantasy tropes, that's like the list that we're going to go into. Okay, so it seems quite promising so far. I have to think about it. Hold on a moment. I have to think about it for this moment. A trope is a scenario in any story. A trope is a scenario. A trope is a scenario where characters react or interact in a way that is expected of them. A trope is a scenario. Okay. I suppose it's a scenario. Characters react or interact. Is a chosen one a scenario? I suppose so. A dark lord is a scenario. I feel like more things that have to do with characters specifically is more like a characteristic of the character, like a trope characteristic type trope. And a scenario would be like, I don't know, the cavalier has arrived. When the battle seems like it's going south very fast and no one is going to win and oh my gosh, it's terrible. Then suddenly help arrives, that kind of thing. That's a scenario, I think. Anyway, our top fantasy tropes and how to make them unique. Okay. All common tropes in fantasy fiction. All common tropes in fantasy fiction. All common tropes in fantasy fiction. I'm not able to talk. Hold on. All common tropes in fantasy fiction share similar elements. Fantasy fiction shares similar elements. Am I the only one that has trouble saying that? Fantasy fiction shares similar elements. In most cases, writers focus on world building, i.e. the magical world in which the story is set. Characters, i.e. archetypes who possess certain attributes and qualities that people expect to find in their favorite fantasy fiction. Or plot, i.e. some kind of great power struggle or attempt to save the world. Okay, writers focus on fantasy fiction. Writers focus on the world building, characters, or the plot. In this list, I will highlight the most popular fantasy tropes, give an example, and then highlight how you can give these tried and tested tropes your very own stamp or twist. Let's start with tropes found in fantasy settings. Okay, so it sounds very, very promising. An example where the trope is, so they're going to give a trope, and then they're going to give an example. That is something that so many articles, oh my gosh, the other articles have not done. Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh, this is actually going to be a good article. World-building tropes, medieval Europe. It's incredibly common to see fantasy novels set in a time that closely resembles the King Arthur medieval period, although often mixed with fantasy elements. Imagine people living in villages with straw roofs and farmyard animals, except the local blacksmith makes magic swords. Or imagine a reluctant hero galloping off on his horse to fight the bad guys, who also happen to be trolls. Where to find it? When we imagine medieval-style fantasy worlds, we often think of George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire series. But another fun example is the Witcher series on Netflix, inspired by the books written by Andrzej Sapkowski. I have no idea how to read his first name, sorry. Which were later adapted into a popular computer game. This is the perfect example of how one world and its story can be told in a number of ways. I feel like they could have gone a little bit more in depth into the example. What do you think? Because they are saying, I will highlight the most popular fantasy tropes, give an example. They did that, okay? And then highlight how you can give these tried and tested tropes your very own stamp or twist. But in order to understand how you can give it a stamp or a twist, you need to go a little bit more detail into the example. So I have read the first book of A Song of Ice and Fire series. But my partner has not. He has not read the first book. I have also not read the second book, although I have it or had it. And I don't know. I just couldn't really get into it. I don't know. I just got tired of it, I guess. But I am a little bit familiar with George R.R. Martin, but people like my partner, he is not familiar with George R.R. Martin's story particularly. So if someone like him were to come across this article and sees this example, they'd be like, kind of know what it is, but not really. I mean, I know it's medieval, and there's dragons, but how is this an example? Like, can you give me a little bit more? I feel like there should be a little bit more description of this medieval style fantasy world. Like, you can just talk, it's just too generic, broad at this point, saying, oh, A Song of Ice and Fire series had a medieval style fantasy world. Like, but what exactly medieval style? Like, what exactly, how is it different from The Witcher? Like, I know about The Witcher, okay? I do know about it, but I'm not familiar with that world at all. Like, what era is it? What setting is it? What country is it? I have no idea about any of that. I just know a tiny little bit. I know it's dark, but I didn't know it was a book. I thought it was just a game at first. I didn't know that it was a book for quite some time, and so I'm not familiar with the books at all. When did the books come out? I don't even know any of that. Completely in the dark about what kind of setting The Witcher has. So it would be good if you could go into a little bit more about that, a little bit more about the setting, like how, like maybe they are both medieval, yes, but they are different. You were saying, this is the perfect example of how one world and its story can be told a number of ways. So if you're saying, so that means you're saying The Witcher and Song of Ice and Fire setting are different. How? How are they different? Maybe you can go into that. Hold on. Oh my gosh. Hope my voice will last. Yeah, a little bit more depth would be nice. Okay. Magical systems. Not magic systems. It's hard to find a fantasy world in fiction that doesn't have some kind of magic system. Whether that means that witches and wizards exist, there's just one character who can cast spells, or that the power can only be found in one mystical artifact. When considering world building and fantasy tropes, it's important to think about the magic system of your made-up world. Who can do it? How does it work? And why? That's interesting that they have roped mystical artifact into magic systems, because I've seen magic artifact or magical artifact as a trope by itself. It wasn't magical artifact or ancient artifact. Magical object as a trope. I've seen that as a trope, separate trope to like just magical powers, I think. But I've seen it as a separate trope. Anyway, where to find it? There are far too many magical systems in fantasy fiction to list here, so take a look at this article, which highlights some of my favorite original takes on magic. Let's see. It goes to another website. It came up on the bottom of my screen, as you can maybe see. It says screenrant.com, fantasy books unique magic systems can't adapt. Interesting. I don't know. Probably not going to look at it, but anyway, they don't even have a list on this website. They're pointing to another website. You could afford to mention a few. I mean, there are so many different, probably, fantasy worlds. Like, if you think about, I don't know, Frozen. I know those are movies. Okay, hold on. I'm just thinking about Frozen and Avatar. Not The Last Airbender, but that's another setting, isn't it? There's all kinds of like fantasy worlds, and if you're talking about medieval style fantasy worlds, there are probably all kinds. I mean, you're saying that there's all kinds, so you are able to give 2 examples up there, but you can't give 2 examples down here. You should be able to give 2 examples down here. Come on, just a few examples. I mean, even the article that I reacted to before, I probably haven't published it yet. I don't know. Of Mythcrians, what was it? It was about magic systems, and they gave a whole ton of examples, but they did focus on a few examples. They were able to give examples, and even though that was an extensive article, they were able to stick to just some examples and not go jumping off all over the place. Like, what is that article site? It's called Tropes TV or something like that. They go all over the place. I can't keep up with all their examples. Although they are quite a useful site. Anyway, it's nice that you go to send us to another link, but maybe you could say, like, this article highlights some of my favorite and original takes on magic, such as this, and this. Just 3 things. You don't even have to explain them, just list them up. And so when we go to the article, we can make sure to look at those ones that you said were your favorite. I mean, that would have been nice. Okay. Fantastical races and creatures. Okay. So there was another fantasy trope article that mentioned, that highlighted dragons as a separate trope. Anyway, surely you didn't think you could get this far without a Tolkien reference. Elves, dwarves, orcs, trolls, and of course, hobbits. Tolkien always went above and beyond to create entire communities of otherworldly creatures in his books. He even went so far as to invent a language for them. So if you're going to write a fantasy book that doesn't take place in this world, you can't avoid using this trope. Maybe. Maybe. I don't know. Actually, I don't know. In fact, why not check out our article on how to create your own fantasy creatures? Interesting. Where to find it. To Kill a Kingdom by Alexander Christo is a great twist in The Little Mermaid, full of undersea monsters like you've never seen before. Oh, so that's what that book is about. I was wondering what that book was about, and there's a picture of a dragon. We don't know where this picture is from. It looks like a painting, but there's no like author's like signature on it, so I don't know if it's a painting or not. Anyway, okay, so what I was pausing on before was, it says, so if you're going to write a fantasy book that doesn't take place in this world, you can't avoid using this fantastical races and creatures trope. But I wonder if you can, in fact, still have magic. Call it a fantasy book. It doesn't take place in this world, but there are no fantastical races and creatures. Can you have just a fantasy book not taking place in this world? It has magic, so it is fantasy, but doesn't have fantastical races and creatures. Is that still fantasy, though? Because it has magic, does that make it fantasy? I have no idea. Let me know if you can avoid using the fantastical creatures trope if you write a book that doesn't take place in this world. I mean, because if you make up a world, it can be anything. It doesn't have to have fantasy creatures, right? Right? Or does it? Or does it? You can't avoid, or can you avoid? Interesting. Okay. Character tropes. We're moving on from setting. Oh, damsel. I always don't know how to pronounce that. In distress. Okay, the damsel in distress. This one, yes, I have seen this a lot. Okay. This is one of the most common fantasy tropes found in older stories, myths, and legends. That is true. I've mentioned this in previous trope article reaction videos in which they mention damsel in distress. I often say that you see damsel in distress in a lot of like the older fantasy books. And they got that right. Yay, that you mentioned that. Okay. Although times have changed and we find fewer and fewer stories full of defenseless women needing a big strong man or rich prince to come to their rescue, having someone who needs rescuing is always a great inciting incident, especially if the hero's journey takes them not just to the trapped person, but also helps them discover plenty about themselves along the way. Where to find it? Every fairy tale is a fantasy book, and most of the older ones, think Rapunzel and Sleeping Beauty, are full of damsels in distress. So you're not going to give a modern example. Is there no modern example? Is this a cop-out? Because if we're talking about, what was this list again? Our top fantasy tropes. Is it a cop-out to say something is a fantasy trope if they have been popular in fairy tales? And we're not talking about, obviously we're not talking about, or are we, Rapunzel and Sleeping Beauty in terms of like Disney type of, or children's book type of watered down, very nice and sweet fairy tales, or are we talking about the Grimm's brothers' original dark and grim stories? I always wondered if Grimm was their real last name, and when I looked it up before, it was their real last name. And is that where the word Grimm comes from? I wondered that. I don't think I didn't like look into it that closely or that deeply, I should say. But it could be. I mean, it's just a matter of subtracting one M from the Grimm's brothers' last name. I feel like I've seen that it's just a coincidence, but who knows? If you want to do a deep dive in etymologies, who knows what you'll find. Anyway, so yes, it has happened in older stories, and there's find fewer and fewer stories full of defenseless women. That is true. Having someone who needs rescuing. So maybe there needs to be a trope, not a trope of damsel in distress. If damsel in distress is kind of turning into a lost trope at this point, like not many people not many people have a damsel in distress story, maybe change it to, what would it be? Someone in distress, like person in distress, or rescue mission, or something like that, might be a way to include damsel in distress and also include just anybody who is in distress. Could that be a thing? Like, could what do you think? Could that be a thing? Could we create a trope that is like, I don't know how you would phrase it, rescuing somebody, or rescue mission, or someone needs rescuing type of situation. And then where to find it, you would mention any story where someone needs rescuing. Do I know any books where someone needed rescuing? Rescuing. Anyone needs rescuing. Oh, actually the book I'm reading now, called Senlin Ascends. I forgot the author name. Josiah Barracks or something like that. Anyway, it's a rescue story. It's a whole big rescue story. This guy loses his wife in the crowd, and then he has to go through this crazy tower or something to try to find his wife. Okay, and that's a rescue story, isn't it? Although there was a twist. But anyway, that could be mentioned here, right? That could be, like, if it's just a rescue story. Okay, so it's not a damsel in distress story, I will say that. But it is a rescue story. So if you have something more broader, like just like rescue or something like that. Needs rescuing could be one. Yeah, needs rescuing. That's a good one, maybe. Okay. Oh my gosh, my voice is not going to last. I already feel it dying. Drinky, water. My water bottle is squeaky. I wonder if you can hear it. Squeaky. Secret heir. This is slightly different to the chosen one trope, where, like Harry Potter, the protagonist discovers they're the key to beating the evil force. A secret heir won't necessarily have any magical power, but they will most probably be the one who is destined to be the next ruler, and often that means the one people want to kill. This is a fun one to twist up, as you can do ridiculous things like have the pet cat be the secret heir because the prince was once turned into an animal, or have the servant be a secret heir because they were the king's hidden love child. Where to find it? It's a great collection of books where women are battling over the throne instead of the usual secret prince. Okay. So it's like the opposite of the damsel in distress is what you're trying to say? I don't know. Anyway, you're becoming lazier and lazier. Sorry to call you out like this, but you're becoming lazier and lazier to giving examples when you can't come up with them from the top of your head. What is this? It even goes to a different website. Bookriot.com. Books about female heirs battling for the crown. Okay, so the secret heir isn't just about women. We know that. I mean, I'm not saying that women can't be secret heirs, but it's definitely not just women. It can be other people too. I don't know why. Is it because we talked about damsel in distress that she's trying to say that here is one where it's not damsel in distress? This is the secret heir, and it's about women who are not in distress. I don't know why. Why is it this women that's specifically giving this example of women? I'm not saying it should be. I'm a woman. I want there to be lots of nice great women characters in fantasy. I want that. But when you're giving examples, you can't just give example to a specific, like, it's women. I don't know. I'm just having trouble. I'm just having problems with that. And there are no, okay, look, listen. Just as I said with the, what was it? Just as I said with the magic systems trope examples, you say, here's a great collection of books where women are battling over the throne instead of the usual secret prince. Such as this book title by this book title by this, and this book title by this, which are one of my top favorite books, or whatever you want to say. Okay? So, just some examples right here so we don't have to go to another. This isn't even going to another article within this website. This is going to a completely different article, which is fine, but maybe some people don't want to do that. Maybe we don't want to go and read a whole other article. We want everything right here and just 3 examples from this article. So if we want to we want to see more examples, we can go to this article if we want to. Don't force us to go to this article. At least give if just one example. Just one example. If you're just so lazy. I'm not saying that they're lazy, but it looks like that, okay? I'm just saying what it looks like. I had high hopes for you. I had high hopes for you, article by Simmonds. It sounds like cinnamon, doesn't it? Cinnamon. Synonym and cinnamon and Simmonds. Villain. Villain? Villain, just villain. We even have a Dark Lord coming up next, but this is interesting. Okay, let's look at villain. All fantasy books have to have a villain. Even though it's not always a monster or a man who is pure evil. In some cases, the villain can be the landscape, the curse, or the inner demon they are struggling to fight. You mean the antagonist? Wait, is villain and antagonist the same thing or different thing? Do they have different meanings, villain and antagonist? Where to find it? Where won't you find a nasty villain in the fantasy genre? From Darth Vader and the Joker to Lord Voldemort. I don't think there's an L in Voldemort. Am I wrong? I thought there was no R in I thought it's not Voldemort. It's Voldemort, right? They made a mistake in the spelling. I feel like they have. Tell me, am I wrong? And Narnia's White Witch. Interesting they say Narnia's white witch. Like, we can identify Darth Vader as being from a certain place. We can identify the Joker as being from a certain place. We can identify Lord Voldemort from being from a certain place. But we can't identify the White Witch from being a certain place. Is there another White Witch somewhere else? Is there? I don't know. Anyway. You sometimes enjoy reading about the villains more than the good guys, girls, people. Okay. You could have just said people here. But anyway, so the reason I said that I thought it was interesting that they're separating out villain and Dark Lord is that I've seen Dark Lord as a trope many times. Okay. I've seen like good versus bad or evil, and they talk about antagonists and like pure evil and antagonists. They don't talk about like villains per se as a trope. It seems a little bit weird to me. Maybe it should be antagonist and not villain, but antagonist. Like, if they're talking about the inner demon, like your inner struggles, that could be an antagonist still, but it's like an inner antagonist, like it's yourself. But yourself is not a villain, or is it? I'm not sure if this makes sense to have villain as a trope. Interesting that they say that all fantasy books have to have a villain. And to be a villain, devil's advocate here, do they have to? Because whenever you write these writing advice articles and you said something has to be a certain way, or it's definitely this, or it's essential, or whatever, you're making a pretty big claim here. So then you have to question, is it essential? Like, is it actually necessary? Does a fantasy book always have to have a villain? Do all fantasy books have a villain, or is it not necessarily a villain and it's an antagonist? And so then you have to ask, what is the difference between a villain and an antagonist, as I mentioned before? Is there a difference? Let me know. I am asking you to let me know so many things. If you don't want to let me know about all the things and you don't feel like it, just let me know about a few of the things. Dark Lord. A Dark Lord is a villain, but not all villains are Dark Lords. Okay. So what is a Dark Lord? The wonderful thing... Oh, I just had a tangent song coming up. The wonderful thing about Tigger is a something from Winnie the Pooh. Do you guys know that one? The wonderful thing about Tigger is a wonderful thing. Bouncy, 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 fun, 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 fun. The wonderful, wonderful thing about Tigger is I'm the only one. I'm the only one. Do you guys know that song? Have you guys ever seen like Winnie the Pooh, like the original Winnie the Poohs? The ones where the narrator is reading the story. I love those. As a kid, I loved those because it's so creative. He's just, tangent here. He's just reading, and then the words start falling. When it starts ringing, the words just actually start melting. It's just so creative. I wish that they made more animations like that. I loved those. The good old days. The good old days when animation was actually great. Animation right now is going towards some weird direction. I like the old school Disney. Can we bring that back for a sec here? I'm just missing that. Like the old Winnie the Pooh and all that stuff. You don't have to do all this realistic 3D stuff, okay? I just want the nostalgia coming back. Good times are gone. Okay, anyway, to not get too depressing in this video. It's a wonderful thing. Okay. Wonderful thing about Tiggers. I'm the only Tigger in the world. I don't know what he says. I can't remember it. He talks just so fast. Anyway, back to this. The wonderful thing about someone who turns to the dark side is discovering their origin story, their backstory, and how they went from being a regular person to the one that everyone fears. Where to find it? The Darkling in Bardugo Shadow and Bone series is my favorite Dark Lord. He's mysterious, enticing, powerful, and as bad as you know he really is. You can't help wanting to know more about him. As he famously says, "Fine, make me your villain." Is a very famous words and is a very, very, very good villain. I really like this Darkling character in the book. That was the only character I liked in the whole series. That guy and Nikolai, the prince. All the other characters I could care less about. Especially the main character. Don't get me start ranting about Lake Bardugo Shadow and Bow series. Come on. I got sucked into the hype, and that is just... so many things to say about that book. Oh my gosh. I could rant a whole video. I could rant a whole storm up. Anyway. This is interesting that they're separating villain from Dark Lord and saying not all villains are Dark Lords. I think I have an idea of but why? Okay, so my thought process is this, okay? Hear me out. Not all villains are Dark Lords. Okay, so if we think about that, then maybe Simmonds is saying villains are just purely evil and terrible. But then when you look at their thing about villains, they are saying that their villain can also be the inner demon that they are struggling to fight. Do they actually mean a demon? But they don't, right? Because they're saying inner demon. And when you say inner demon, you usually mean like your own personal like struggles, like you're struggling something with yourself, like your internal struggles, right? But the internal struggle isn't pure evil, right? So I think they should have talked about the evil or the bad guy trope. Just say the bad guy trope, and then say the Dark Lord trope. And then maybe say like the inner struggles isn't particularly a trope. It's like a plot device, I guess. I don't know. Or a character's characteristic. I don't know. It gets really complicated when you're talking about like character tropes, because it could just be a characteristic of the character that is like just some characters have it and not all characters. And it's just like, it's just the thing. It's not particularly a trope. Which is a way a character reacts to the interaction with a scenario or whatever. So that's interesting that they separate out the Dark Lord from the villain. I don't completely understand what they mean by this part. This whole part with the villain and the Dark Lord. I understand the Dark Lord is a trope because I've seen it. But I don't understand what they're talking about. The Dark Lord is a little bit different. Maybe they want to talk about gray characters. These are characters that seem evil, but there's something about them that is like, they're not completely evil, and you can see that, like, because maybe you know their backstory or whatever. There's something about them that's a little bit not completely evil. So you're like, wait, are they good? Are they bad? I'm not sure what I think about this character. It's so interesting. And then you get invested in the story. So maybe they want to talk about the Dark Lord. They want to say that the Dark Lord is a gray character. But the thing is, a Dark Lord in other fantasy trope articles I've seen is just a dark evil lord. A dark evil overlord type of character. So he's like just evil, like Voldemort. But in this article, they're saying that Voldemort is just a villain. So, okay, here's the question. Here's the question about not villain versus antagonist. Here's a question for you guys to think about, okay? So, what is the difference between villain, antagonist, and Dark Lord? We need to think about that. Plot tropes. Training sequences. I've seen this trope. I've seen this trope come up in other places. Okay. This is where the protagonist has to do something heroic, but they aren't ready yet. So you know what they need to do? They need to train. Training sequences are not only fun to watch, but they are a great plot device to move time forward and to show how the hero is progressing. Sometimes it's used as a midpoint marker just before the real action starts. It's also a lovely way to introduce another character trope, the mentor. This may be another main character that only comes into play in Act 2. Where to find it? The Hunger Games trilogy has a number of training scenes, which also prove as a great way to show Katniss' character as well as that of her rivals and those in power. In the same vein, Mulan also uses this trope to highlight her struggle of hiding that she's a woman fighting amongst big burly men. Not all of them were big and burly, at least not in the movie. Training sequence. I have nothing to say about training sequences, I don't think. Yeah, it's often used a midpoint marker. They're not giving the warning about that the training sequence can't be an overnight thing, because sometimes some heroes just magically master the art of the sword overnight. And they can fight in the battle. And no, that is not how it works. In reality, you cannot do that. Like, if you've never wielded a sword in your life for a battle, you can't suddenly do that perfectly. I actually wrote a story that was going to have a training sequence in it, but then I thought, you know what? I don't want to deal with I don't want to deal with training sequences. I'm starting to sound like Elmer Fudd. I don't want to deal with training sequences. Okay. At that point of writing the story, I wanted to get to the exciting part. So I decided that I would actually not have the training sequence trope. And I would say, okay, main character is given a sword. They give her a sword. But she doesn't have time to learn how to use it because she also needs time to try to perfect her magic, which she also doesn't have time to learn. And so by the time we get to the battle, she can hardly do anything. And when she tries to do something, it's actually a danger to others because she's swinging around this sword she doesn't know how to use. And it's heavy to her because she didn't train for it. And so people actually say, actually, Bethany, go to the side. Just go to the side. We'll do the fighting, and you try to figure out your magic, which is important to stopping this evil rat creature from killing more civilians. Okay, you just need to focus on that, and we'll do the battle. Okay, we'll do the battle. And so with her magic, she doesn't even have time to figure it out. So it's just really all over the place. And I tried to be as realistic as I could, but I had fun with that. That was fun. It's better not. I didn't feel like dealing with a training sequence. I didn't want to look up how somebody learns to use a sword. I mean, I could. I just didn't feel like it. And it was better without. It was better that I avoided it. Anyway, that was a bit of a sidetrack. So yeah, they didn't mention that part of it's not an overnight thing. Which sometimes people just write it like that. But, anyway, I guess they're inferring, I guess you can be inferred that they kind of said that. So, they aren't ready yet to be a heroic. So what they need to do, they need to train. Kind of, that's what they say. Anyway, examples were very nice, clear examples. Exactly what I wanted to do before for the magic system and for the secret air. We could have done something with that, couldn't we? I think so. Okay, the quest. A quest is when the characters are sent on a journey and a bad thing, or 20, will happen. The quest can be as simple as crossing a river or as complicated as crossing an entire kingdom in order to drop a ring into a fiery mountain. I see you're talking about a specific thing here. A lot of articles tend to talk about Lord of the Rings without talking about Lord of the Rings because it's so popular and everyone can, anyone, many people, not anyone, many people will know this reference, which is very interesting. Where to find it? In the movie Love and Monsters. What? I have no idea what that one is. Is it popular? I don't know. In the movie Love and Monsters, an asteroid has released chemicals that make small creatures into huge monsters, i.e. killer centipedes, and the main character has to find his ex-girlfriend at the next camp without getting killed. Highly entertaining. What? We're talking, okay, this is an article about writing, and I know that bringing movies in is good too, but maybe you could mention a quest. We already got this reference to Lord of the Rings. Why not get into it a little bit more? Obviously, Simmonds liked this movie. She likes this movie. She loved this movie. It was highly entertaining to her. But I don't know. This was a lot of explaining to do for a movie that not many people might know about. because you have to do lots of explaining, right? Explaining things. But you can use the Lord of the Rings. You already gave an example. Why didn't you use the same example? Come on. Or if you wanted to use a simple example, I don't know. I don't know. I feel like this is a simple enough example. Lord of the Rings example. I mean, it's the quest story. It's like the quest story of all the quest stories. I'm writing a quest story right now. Okay. Good guys fighting evil. This is interesting. Interesting that we have this good versus bad, I guess. I've seen that trope before. Good guys fighting evil. Heroes need to win. There are no two ways about it, especially in a fantasy novel. But do they though? Do they need to win? Do they need to win? That is the question. In real life, there's a gray area when it comes to politics and what is fair, because life isn't really that black and white, but it is in fantasy. Okay? Your readers need to root for someone, and they need to know who that someone is, so make sure that even if your hero has flaws, ultimately we know who's wrong and who's right. Really, we need to do this. We have to make sure that we absolutely do this. Do we? Do we? I don't think we do. My opinion. Where to find it? V.E. Schwab does this really well in her Shades of Magic series, with the main character, Kel, fighting both external evil forces and the dark magic inside of himself. Oh, so that's what that story is about. Okay. I don't keep track of a lot of hyped up stories. But anyway, so your readers need to root for someone. That is true. That is true. Okay. They need to know who that someone is. That is also true. So make sure that even if your hero has flaws, ultimately we know who's right, who's wrong and right. But do we need to know who's wrong and right? We can still root for someone and we know who that someone is. Do we need to really know if they're right or wrong? What if it's an anti-hero? Then they could be doing something wrong, but we can still root for them. Or am I actually giving an example that says exactly this? Is an anti-hero this? But would we always know if an anti-hero is right or wrong? If we're talking about like gray areas and stuff. There's gray areas because life isn't black and white. But it is in fantasy. That is so weird to say, because is it in fantasy? If we know who's wrong and right in fantasy. So basically Simmonds believes, I say a lot of repeating words, okay? I say a lot of repeating words and repeat myself because I'm thinking. We know who's wrong and who's right because fantasy is black and white. That rhymes. But it's not always, right? It can be black and white, but it's not always, because there are gray characters. Simmonds not like gray characters or doesn't even know about them, which is odd. This is weird. Why are we saying that fantasy is black and white? It can be black and white, but not always black and white. There was an article before that talked about the good versus evil trope. It might have been the good versus bad trope or something like that. And they did talk about some kind of gray area a little bit, like a mention. And that was a little bit, I mean, I didn't really like that article, but that was a little bit better than saying this, because it is in fantasy, but it can be. Life isn't really black and white, but it can be in fantasy, and it can also be a gray area, just like life is. Could have been something like that. Okay, we're closing in on the ending. This is, I think, the last trope it looks like. Okay. Dead parents, loved ones. It's a lot harder for a young protagonist. Okay, let me just first mention dead parents, young loved ones is not a trope that I have seen before. As a trope, I haven't seen it before. I have seen the orphan as a trope, however. It's a lot harder for a young protagonist to go on a big adventure, fight monsters and bad guys, and take unnecessary risk if their parents or guardians are there to stop them. So what forces a child to grow up? What motivates someone to do wild things? How do you add trauma and grief to someone's backstory that would justify the decisions they go on to make? Kill off the ones they love. You don't have to kill them, but often they're dead. I have to say, often they're dead. Where to find it? Neil Gaiman handled this trope really well with his novel, The Graveyard Book, about a young orphan who is raised in a cemetery by supernatural creatures. Also, that's what that book is about. The Walking Dead is also really good at dealing with grief and loss in fantasy. The Walking Dead? Isn't that whole zombie TV series that people were obsessed with years ago? Why are we talking about The Walking Dead all of a sudden? It's also really good at dealing with grief and loss in fantasy. Oh, it is. How? How is it? How is it? How? We're not getting into that at all, are we? Okay. This as a trope is interesting that it's a trope named like this. I mean, I think it could have been the orphan trope. But then if you talk about loved ones, dead loved ones isn't always an orphan. So I guess it makes sense actually to have dead parents, loved ones as a trope. Because just because the loved one is dead doesn't mean that's always going to be a parent. Maybe Simmonds has a point here, naming it this way. Okay, yes, I agree with that. Okay, so, I mean, killing off the ones they love, I mean, I would say, oh yeah, that does it. That will give them trauma and grief. It doesn't always have to be killing them off, but you can do that. I wouldn't say... What would I wouldn't say? I don't know. I lost my train of thought. How to effectively use fantasy tropes in your writing. We're getting into the how. We could have gotten into the how in each individual trope when we talked about it. I said the same thing in another article that said they would give examples and then give examples and tell you how to, and then they wouldn't do it until the end. I don't think it benefits us from going like back and forth unless they give some really nice examples coming up. Like, I don't want to keep going back to checking the tropes, just for easy readability. It's good to have everything in one place. That's just my suggestion. Anyway. As you have seen, when it comes to common fantasy tropes and the genre in general, there's no right or wrong, just good and evil. The joy of writing fantasy is that you can create any world you want and any characters you want, and as long as you stick to some of these expected fantasy tropes, you can make it work. Yes, okay. So what makes a good fantasy novel? Exactly, good question. And how can you give your readers what they expect while not being predictable or trite? I need a drink of water. Hold on. Okay. The secret lies in taking the very best from the books and movies people love, the most common tropes that people don't want to let go of, and considering the needs of the modern reader. Harry Potter and The Hobbit have had their time in the limelight. It's time to create fantastical worlds that reflect how society keeps changing and inspires new readers. Okay. So, Write what people want, but not what you want, even though you need to write what you want in order for you to enjoy your writing, in order for it to be an enjoyable read. But we're not going to do that, are we? Or are we? Let's read on. With this in mind, it's no wonder we've seen a rise in fantasy written for women by women, feminist fantasy, middle grade and YA fantasy, books written by diverse authors incorporating cultures that we don't see as often, i.e. not just European folklore, as well as more LGBT fantasy and characters that embrace physical or mental challenges, i.e. not as a flaw but simply as something lots of people live with. So how can you take these tropes and make them work for you? Okay. So this is, I think Simmonds is thinking about writers that want to write a fantasy novel with publishing in mind. Which you might want to think about what the modern reader wants, but I would personally suggest that you write what you want to write. And if you like your story, if you enjoy it and you enjoy the story, certainly there's going to be someone else out there who enjoys it as much as you do. I mean, because it makes sense. If there's one person who likes Harry Potter, there are going to be other people who like Harry Potter. And that is the case. That is true. So, anyway. Write what you know. Yes, I know you have never lived in a land where unicorns shoot fire out of their mouths or dragons are the size of sparrows, but that doesn't mean you can't bring a little authenticity from this world to your own. Even if your book is set in space or 10,000 years from now, readers still want to connect to your characters and the situations they find themselves in. So if you introduce a trope like, say, an innocent hero having to fight evil, try and remember what it felt like when you stood up to a bully as a child or when you had to have a difficult conversation with your boss. I see. So I see this thing about write what you know as an advice being like thrown around out there and people being against it because it's like, of course, I've never seen a unicorn in my life. How am I going to write what I know if I want to write about a unicorn but I've never seen it? And yes, Simmonds is acknowledging that, yes, you have never lived in a land where unicorns are. But that doesn't mean you can't bring a little authenticity from this world into your own. So I understand that. That is a better way to go about this write what you know advice. So like one book that I'm trying to rewrite has the main character is facing a big life change. And to take this write what you know thing in, when I have gone through a big life change, you know, I have have certain feelings, right? So I try to remember those feelings and incorporate them into my story. So the character might be feeling some sense of uncertainty of the future, or feeling ready but not feeling as ready as she thought she felt. And in the moment when her life actually drastically changes, she's actually not entirely sure how to go about it. She kind of fumbles along the way a lot, and she feels like she is letting others down. And I've definitely, and I've gone through those feelings. So that is the what you know thing. So you're not writing about like if you've never been to Iceland and you write about a fantasy world inspired by Iceland. But maybe you've seen snow, so you can write about what snow makes you feel, and maybe the character feels the same way. I don't know, something like that. I think that's what they mean by write what you know. And that is a very good thing to say, Simmonds. That is something we finally agree on. You are mentioning something that not many people mention. You can bring in a little authenticity from this world into your own, just a little bit to make it a little bit real and to make readers want to, you know, like the character or connect with the character. Connect to your characters and situations. Use them sparingly. Just because you love certain fantasy tropes, that doesn't necessarily mean you should add them to your story. Writing is hard work. Don't make your job harder by adding tropes to your story that have no place being there. Think of your plotting characters first, then see what works. Readers can tell when storylines have been forced to accommodate a scene that doesn't really add anything. Here are some fantasy prompts to get you started. Okay, finally a link that links to an article in their own website. Okay. 140 fun fantasy prompts. 140. Oh, I can kind of imagine though, actually. Yeah, use them sparingly. But yeah, so I don't think use them sparingly is the advice. Don't add tropes to your story that have no place in being there. So like out of context kind of tropes. Like your world does not have you forcibly make a situation in which your character's parents die so that you can turn them into an orphan that goes on a quest to fight dragons. Like there was no indication or no reason for them to die other than to create plot. Something like that. Or like you start introducing all these fantasy creatures, but your world, it takes place on Earth. And initially there were no fantasy creatures, but suddenly there are because you thought, oh, I have to write about all the tropes. I don't know though. Can you write a fantasy story with all the tropes? I think it can be done. It'll be a wild ride, certainly, but it can be done. It'll just be wild. It might be fun to write. And fun to read, too. It might be a headache to read, but it might be fun to read as well. Use them sparingly, I think. Choose your tropes well might have been a better title. And then you can talk about don't add tropes to your story that have no place in being there. You know, that kind of thing. So it's a kind of weird title to this section. That's all I'm saying. Because I thought sparingly, like, some fantasy stories have a lot of tropes in them. Be brave. If you write fantasy, the chances are you read and watch or even play a lot of it too. That means you may well feel like certain rules are set in stone. Orcs are bad, damsels need rescuing, and all heroes rise to the challenge and defeat evil at the end. But what if you went against the grain? What if you were brave and did something so unexpected, so uncomfortable that everyone would remember your book forever? For instance, what if the evil Dark Lord rescued the Sleeping Beauty? What if orcs are the good guys? And what if the hero not only lost his power but didn't care about winning? That in itself would make for an interesting premise. Writing makes you vulnerable, whatever the genre, blah, blah, blah. So brave and take the risk. Okay. Basically, they're talking about twists. They're talking about twist in tropes. Twist the tropes. That's what they're talking about. It's a good thing to talk about. And it's something that I had expected them to talk about when they said away up here, where they said how you can give these tried and tested tropes your very own stamp or twist. So I thought they were going to talk more about the twist, but is it this only this section, this Be Brave section, that they're talking about the twists? I mean, it's all good stuff that they're saying here, but it could go into a little more in depth. Maybe each individual trope that they listed should have like something that you could do to twist it at the end. That would have been nice to have it all there in one place, every single trope. I think you could have done that with examples and not be so cheap on examples. Not send us to other websites for examples. Step into a whole new world. A whole new world. I hope you've enjoyed this article and it has helped you on your own writing journey, your very own quest for the perfect fantasy tropes. Perfect. Or imperfect. I mean, remember to look at both the real world around you and deep inside yourself and bring all of that emotion and experience to your fantasy books. Add the tropes that matter, twist them up, make them your own, and most of all, have fun. Because if you aren't feeling what your character is feeling, if you don't want to save the world from more trite and predictable fantasy books, and if you're not bravely fighting good and evil for world domination in the fantasy genre, okay, just finishing your book is a good start. Then what are you waiting for? Get going. There's a whole world of fantasy out there for you to conquer. Dramatic ending. Simmonds is actually an author, a fantasy author. What kind of fantasy? Magical, historical, and full of complex women, page-turning twists, and plenty of romance. Oh, she's a romantasy author. Okay. Although she makes it sound like in the beginning that she didn't like romance, but anyway. So that is why. So she really focuses on women in her novels. So that is why the damsel in distress was there's so few stories. And because there's so few stories, she didn't even bother giving examples. Okay. Anyway, step into a whole new world. You know, you didn't really give much about twists, even though you said you would give some how to twist. So after reading this article, I don't feel like I know how to twist the twists. How to twist the tropes. So I don't really know. This article has some good parts. It has some good parts. Also has some parts that need working on. Could use with some more examples. At least a few from those websites that you were trying to send us to, and give a twist, because we've come down here and we still haven't gotten like twists. We haven't gotten twists. We've gotten some in here, but you could have gone a little bit better. Whole New World it's a very dramatic ending to this article. A very nice dramatic ending. However, I don't know what I've learned particularly. Some slightly strange things. This article is also a 3. It's like the other articles. There hasn't been. It might be a 3.5. Okay, with some of the stuff that I thought was good that other articles haven't done, so I'll give you a 3.5, but I haven't seen one that's a 4 or a 5, which is weird. There should be some out there, you would think. Well, anyway, so this was an article. This was quite an article. It's probably a very long video, but let me know what you thought about this article. What rating would you give it out of a 5? And do you find it useful? How do you find it useful? What could they do better? I had some questions. I promptly forgot what they were, but you know what they were. Oh yes, the villain, Dark Lord, and antagonist. Like, how are those 3 different? Or are they different at all? Does villain and Dark Lord, is that included in an antagonist? Like, antagonist is the umbrella term. Anyway, that is it for this article, The Very Best Fantasy Tropes. Oh, right. I was going to see when this was written. Sometimes they say nothing. Nothing. I don't know when it was written. Sometimes it's in the URL, but I don't see it. Dark and light, and dark and light, and dark. Okay, stop. I'll stop. Some people don't like flashing things, and neither do I, so why am I doing it? I'll stop. I won't do it anymore. Sorry about that. So disappointment number, I don't know what. Yeah. Anyway, that's the end of this video. I hope you liked it. Leave comments, leave answers, leave questions. Discuss amongst yourselves and be nice to each other. I hope you have a lovely day, and you will hear me in the next video. My voice is so tired. The fox is out.